The Nikon 500mm f5.6 PF lens and the 300mm f2.8. These are very different lenses for very different situations, but how do they get on with these teleconverters? So hi folks, let's talk about teleconverters. I made a video back in spring of 2019 where I compared this 300mm with the 1.4 times and 2 times teleconverters with my old 200 to 500mm zoom lens. At the time, I actually mentioned that one of the things I'd really like to try and do is do a similar test of this guy with the teleconverters against the 500mm PF lens, and I also got a number of comments on that video. So the people writing those comments wanted to know specifically, would the 300mm and a 1.7 times teleconverter get anywhere near the quality of a 500mm sort of set lens? So since then I have indeed got myself a 500mm PF lens, so I can do that test. I've actually had all the bits and pieces I needed to make this video that I have promised the channel on a number of occasions for quite a while now, but I didn't really have the psych to make it earlier in the year, and then I realised that it would be a perfect thing to do in the late autumn, in the winter, when I knew that we were going to have a baby, and so a project that I can do pretty much here in the garden, down at the beach and at the computer was absolutely ideal. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a quick look at these two lenses, and then we're going to try them out with all of the teleconverters and have a chat about how useful or not that might be for wildlife photography, because that's the kind of photography that I'm interested in doing. The Nikon 500mm PF lens is fairly new. It was released about 2 years ago now. It uses what's called a phase Fresnel lens, and it means that they can get the 500mm focal length in this incredibly small package. It's about the same weight as my 70 to 200 f2.8 zoom. It's a little bit longer than that, but it's generally similar size and weight to that, so that's incredible for a 500mm lens. Now the trade-off, of course, is that this is not as fast a lens, so that's where there's a slight trade-off, but it is incredibly sharp. It's incredibly versatile and portable because of the small size, and honestly, having such a light lens has meant that I've taken it to places where I otherwise wouldn't have bothered to take my sort of camera and wildlife lens, and that has meant that I've got shots that I wouldn't otherwise have got, so that is a total win for me. So, on the other hand, the 300mm f2.8, this is the latest version of that lens. It is quite a beast. It is so much heftier than the 500mm, but it has that super fast f2.8 maximum aperture, which means that it can get 4 times the light onto the sensor compared to the 500mm PF. And here in Scotland, if you're doing wildlife photography in the gloomy evenings and mornings, you need that. That can be really, really useful. It can be the difference between getting something usable and not. And both lenses have absolutely fantastic vibration reduction, and their autofocus is very, very quick, although I have a feeling that the 300 is slightly faster autofocusing on my cameras than the 500 is, but we'll test that later, so we're going to find out. So teleconverter consists of some optics and contacts that you put in between your lens and your camera, and basically what it does is it maintains all the autofocus and aperture contacts with your lens, and it magnifies the image circle at the back of the lens so that you get a magnified image on your sensor. So this is a 1.4 times teleconverter. That means that the image on the back of the sensor will be 1.4 times what it would have been if you had just had the lens on its own. Obviously, if you are putting extra glass elements in the optical path, you are inevitably going to get some loss of image quality. However, if the conditions allow for you to get a good image with the teleconverter, it will generally have better resolution than if you were to take the image without the teleconverter and crop it. And we'll actually demonstrate that a little bit later on in this video. The biggest trade-off with teleconverters is that actually you lose a bit of light when you use a teleconverter. So when I put a 1.4 times teleconverter on my lens, I will in fact lose a stop of light. If I use the 1.7 times teleconverter, it's 1.5 stops of light. And if you go up to the 2 times teleconverter, you actually also lose 2 whole f-stops of light. Now, teleconverters have gained a bit of a bad rep, mostly because of that light loss and some of the issues that are associated with it. Now, one of the main ones is that on DSLR cameras, you might get to a situation where the autofocus system no longer works very well. That's because as you reduce the amount of light that's getting through the lens assembly, you make the image very, very dark in a DSLR. And the way that the autofocus system actually works in a digital SLR is that that mirror that's in there isn't actually 100% reflective. It's mostly, most of the light bounces off there up into the prism and into your viewfinder, but a tiny proportion goes through it and onto a separate assembly that is the autofocus sensor. Now, because the image is already getting really dark in terms of what you might see out the viewfinder, what the autofocus sensor is seeing is getting even darker. And actually what this means practically is that you're actually only able to use some of the autofocusing points, and if you go to above f8, you may find that your autofocus system simply doesn't work at all. The other point is that because there are effectively 2 different paths for the light going to the sensor when the mirror's up versus going to that autofocus sensor when the mirror's down, there's actually the possibility for some tiny misalignment of those. So what that means is you might find there's a slight error in the autofocus. Now, of course, if you start magnifying everything with teleconverters, the chances of that being obvious, making an effect on your images, actually increases. So there's another situation in which teleconverters can actually cause an issue. However, callous as it may sound, I don't care. Why don't I care? Because I don't shoot with a DSLR. I shoot with a Nikon Z7 and a Nikon Z6, and those are mirrorless cameras. So exactly as the name suggests, there is no mirror. There is also no separate autofocus sensor. Autofocus is done on the sensor. Viewing through the electronic viewfinder is viewing an image directly from the sensor. So there is no room for misalignment at all. And what that effectively means is with a mirrorless camera, the autofocus system is not going to care that you've gone above f8. It doesn't care that you increase the aperture. All that happens as you do this is the autofocus system gets slower, but it doesn't cease to function with some kind of cutoff like it does in the DSLR. So basically, as long as there's enough contrast in the image, the autofocus system in the mirrorless camera is still going to work on any of the autofocus points. It's not going to make a difference whether it's the center point or a point right up in the corner somewhere. They're all going to work. They're just going to get slower as the light level decreases. And that means that you can still continue to use autofocus at much higher apertures like f11 or f16, and there's no problem with doing that apart from the fact that things will really start to slow down. And we'll actually come and talk about that a little bit later as well, because I actually did some autofocus speed tests. So there are some other issues that come with teleconverters, regardless of whether you're shooting a mirrorless camera or a DSLR. And one of the main ones is when you increase the focal length, as you do with a teleconverter, on these already long lenses, you have to be really, really careful about camera shake. Even a tiny little bit of shake is going to get magnified and is going to be obvious in your images. Also, because the teleconverter magnifies the image off the back of the lens, you need your lens to be really sharp and good quality to begin with. There's no point in putting a teleconverter on the back of a lens that isn't sharp, because you're just going to be disappointed. Now, luckily, these two lenses are very, very sharp indeed, so that shouldn't be an issue. And these are the latest versions of the teleconverters that Nikon produces for Nikon F-mount to date. Finally, teleconverters are not magic. If your subject is too far away, that's going to cause distortion and sort of blurriness, you're not going to do any better by putting a teleconverter in between and magnifying that distortion and blurriness. A way to think about it is, if you're still going to need to crop the image after you've used the teleconverter, you're probably better off trying to get closer. However, I think that in this mirrorless world that I'm now in, I think that the time of the teleconverter has kind of arrived, because so many of the traditional issues with teleconverters were very much DSLR based. They are actually going to do a lot better on mirrorless systems. But what we need to do in order to clear this up is we need to take these lenses and these teleconverters down the beach, and we need to take some test images. Okay, so I've come down to the beach and I've got my Nikon Z7 with the FTZ adapter, and I've got the wireless remote attached so that I can fire off shots without touching the camera and inducing any camera shake. And I've got the 300mm here and the 500, and we're going to do a few test shots with this little guy. Thought that might be appropriate for doing some lens tests on the beach. Anyway, I'm going to put this little guy on a rock about 10 meters away, and I'm going to try a series of shots with the teleconverters on the 300, and I'm going to try a series of shots with the teleconverter on the 500 as well, and we'll just see how we get on in terms of the quality at that short distance. And then, because in the comments to that previous video on teleconverters with this 300mm, I got a comment where somebody was mentioning that, yeah, the teleconverters work really well, even to 2 times on this lens at short range, but they're getting notable image quality drop off at range. So we'll also stick this little oyster catcher about 50 meters away, and we'll take some more shots of it there. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to take shots using the camera in aperture priority mode, which means that the shutter speed will just be set so that I get my base ISO of 64, and we're on the tripod, vibration reduction's turned off. So, and I'll take a few images each time, so we should get a clean image each time. And of course, as always, I'll be focusing a single autofocus point on the eye of the oyster catcher. So, well and done. So that's the testing done, both distances, and I've also videoed the range marker on the top of the camera, on the top of the lens, sorry, going from infinity back to this close focus point for all the different combinations. So when we look at that in the video editor, we can actually determine how quickly each lens racks focus with the teleconverter on this camera. So it's time to pack all this up, take everything back home, load the pictures into Lightroom, and we'll have a chat back at my desk and see how these different lenses and the teleconverters actually performed this morning. Okay, so we're back at the desk, and I brought all of those images into Lightroom and I've gone through them and I've made some notes, and I have the all-important cup of coffee. So we'll get on and have a look through these. Now I should just say here that the differences that I can see on the screen here might not really show up as well through onto YouTube, but what I'm going to do, rather than show you on the screen, I'm just going to put them up at 100% on the video. But yeah, I'll try and describe what I see as best as I can, and obviously feel free to pause and have a proper look at them, you know, at your leisure. So firstly, the 300mm 2.8 without any teleconverters. In a word, stunning. It's great at 2.8, it's even better at f4 if you stop it down, and it keeps getting better at 5.6 and f8's absolutely phenomenal lens. And yeah, you get what you pay for. This is a very serious pro bit of glass. You expect it to be good, and it really does deliver. In terms of being out in the field and photographing a subject of this size, the 300mm is probably pushing it a bit. That subject is probably a little bit too far away, but you can still see in the test images that, you know, very, very sharp indeed. With the 1.4 times teleconverter, we get a 420mm lens with a maximum aperture of f4. The image quality is good at f4. It's even better if you stop it down to 5.6, and same as before, f8, absolutely phenomenal. Once we put the 1.7 times teleconverter on this lens, we have a 510mm with a maximum aperture of 4.8. It's slightly soft at f4.8. It does improve if you stop it down to 5.6 though, and if you go to f8, it's actually really quite good still. Once we get on to the 2 times teleconverter, which makes this lens a 600mm f5.6, we see pretty much the same story as we did in the previous video I made, in that it is a little bit soft at 5.6, but there is a notable improvement when you go to f8. And, you know, that's kind of what you expect. And if you actually go all the way to f11, it's really very good. So some people asked me how the 300mm might compare with its 1.7 times teleconverter to the f5.6 500mm PF lens. They have got a similar maximum aperture, and they have got a very similar focal length, 510mm versus a native 500. Looking at the images from both at f5.6, there's absolutely no contest whatsoever. The 500mm PF lens is sharper, the image is cleaner, it's punchier, it's, you know, it's just better than putting a teleconverter on this. We stop the 300 and the 1.7 times down to f8. There is definitely an improvement, but you know what? The 500mm PF lens looks a little bit better at f8 as well, and so it still wipes the floor with the teleconverter combination. Because yeah, the 500mm is a very, very sharp lens indeed, and there's always going to be some image degradation with using a teleconverter, so honestly I don't think there was really any chance that the converted 300 was going to measure up. So let's have a look at how this 500mm performed with teleconverters. So the 500 with no teleconverters is stunning. At 5.6 it's really, really good. And while that isn't the fastest aperture, really with the noise reduction available nowadays and the kind of ISO performance of modern cameras, that's not an issue. Actually, it's pretty good. It's much cleaner and sharper than my 200 to 500 ever was. And yeah, if you stop it down to f8, it's even better. It's really, really very good. When you stick a 1.4 times teleconverter on this lens, you end up with a 700mm f8 lens. And I was actually surprised by how good this was. Even at f8, really pretty good. Some good detail and still sort of really nice punchiness, sort of micro contrast to the image, which is often something that you lose when you put a teleconverter on. And if you're able to stop it down and go to f11, it's really good. It's really quite impressive. So the 1.7 times teleconverter makes it an 850mm, and the maximum aperture is then f9.5. And yeah, okay, wide open, it is slightly soft, but there's still a heck of a lot of detail there, and I suspect it's better than cropping. And yeah, if you are able to stop it down to f11, again, that's not actually very far, that's just a half stop, there is a really noticeable improvement. So how about the 2 times teleconverter? That makes this a 1000mm lens with a maximum aperture of f11. So yeah, there is some softness. I accept that. It is not as sharp, as razor sharp as the image without a teleconverter. But again, I'm actually surprised by how well this lens has done with teleconverters. And yeah, stopping down to f16 and really risking a bit of diffraction, the results are actually very, very good. Now, obviously, getting a situation in the field where you could use this lens at f16 might be a bit tricky, but if you can, it works. And that's quite impressive. So there's this idea floating around that you might be able to achieve the same image quality with cropping as you might get with a teleconverter. And I don't believe it, but since we've got these test images, I'm actually going to try it. So here is a comparison of the original image from the 500mm PF lens, expanded 1.4 times, and next to it is the image from the 1.4 times teleconverter. Now it's pretty clear that the image from the 1.4 times teleconverter has more detail retained in it. The same is true here with the 1.7 times, and with the 2 times it's absolutely the same story. In all 3 cases, there's absolutely no question that there is more detail retained in the image if you use the teleconverter and you're able to get that shot. So no, cropping and scaling is in no way better than using a teleconverter on my Z7 with these lenses, with these teleconverters under those test conditions. So unless your teleconverter is incredibly soft, the optically magnified image is always going to be better than the effectively digitally magnified image where you've had to expand those pixels effectively beyond 100%. There is some loss of contrast in the teleconverted images, but loss of contrast can be corrected in post-processing, whereas loss of resolution cannot. So yeah, a win for the teleconverters there. If we were using Canon gear, something I would talk about now would be stacking of teleconverters. And with those, you can actually take, say, a 2 times and a 1.4 times, and you put a small extension tube in between them, and you can mount them all along there. It's like a great big train of converters, and you can achieve, you know, huge magnifications doing that. So yeah, with Nikon teleconverters, that is simply not possible because on the actual mount of the teleconverter there's a little tab that sticks out, which means you can only mount the teleconverter on a lens that's got a specific cutout for that tab to kind of nest into. And you can file the tab off in order to stack your teleconverters or mount them on lenses for which they were not designed. But frankly, I want to keep the value of my teleconverters if I ever want to resell them, and I also don't trust that I would catch absolutely all of the little bits of metal filings if I did that, and I do not like the idea of little metal filings anywhere near the insides of my lenses or my cameras, so not going to go there. Earlier on I mentioned that there is a loss in autofocusing speed when you put a teleconverter on, and I actually measured this in the field. So the results I'm going to show you of doing that are very much for my setup of using a Nikon Z7 with an FTZ adapter and these f-mount lenses. I know for a fact that both of these lenses would be faster on a DSLR because the autofocusing speed of the Z7 and the FTZ is not up to the speeds of SLRs. Despite the improvements that have come with firmware, it's not quite up at that speed. Now, Nikon have just released a Nikon Z7 II and a Nikon Z6 II. Maybe those will have more improvements in the autofocus speed. Maybe they'll be closer to DSLRs in how they work with f-mount lenses. Only time will tell. But anyway, in terms of using these teleconverters, what we're actually looking at is the relative differences between these lenses and between these lenses with teleconverters on my Z7 body. And then you can imagine that that will probably scale on other camera bodies, but will probably be a kind of similar ratio. So here are some results. Without the teleconverter, the autofocus is actually pretty quick on both of these lenses. The 300mm is a little bit quicker, as I suspected it would be. Adding the 1.4 times teleconverter resulted in a 30% drop in the autofocus speed on the 300, a similar drop on the 500, with the converted 300 still being a little bit faster. 1.7 times teleconverter, the 300 is still faster, but not much. They both dropped quite a bit. You know, really starting to see a hit now. And now finally with the 2 times teleconverter, both lenses focus equally slowly. They both take about a quarter of a second to lock focus. And for the 300mm, that is literally taking twice as long to acquire focus. So actually that is really quite a significant reduction in the autofocusing speed, and something that you really have to think about if you're using these out in the field. So in conclusion, I was surprised by how well both these lenses performed with the teleconverters. With a 300mm f2.8, it was always going to work well with the 1.4 times, but at closer range I was impressed with the 1.7 times and the 2 times as well. And the maximum aperture there with the 2 times teleconverter is only f5.6, which is where the 500mm starts. So that's not at all daft for use out in the field, and you know, you'd probably be able to stop it down a little bit even then. With the 500mm PF, you're starting at f5.6, and so by the time you've got a 2 times teleconverter on there, you're at f11, which is, you know, that's quite high. So you're going to need some really serious stabilization of your camera setup, or some really, really good light in order to be able to use that. But if you can, I was really, really impressed by the image quality. I was really surprised. I didn't think that that was going to be a usable combination. Interestingly, Canon have recently released or announced, not sure which, I'm not really that up on the Canon ecosystem, but they've got some long lenses that are maximum f11. So clearly the industry doesn't think that f11 is that daft, and it's all because the ISO performance of these cameras and the fact that with mirrorless it doesn't matter that you're at those really quite high f-stops, because you can still focus because you're doing it on the sensor, it all still works. So in my test, I used the camera ISO 64. I had it on a tripod, I had the silent shutter on, I had a remote release, and I was basically just adjusting the shutter speed for the aperture just to get a reasonable exposure. And that's not really a very real-world scenario in terms of wildlife photography. It allows us to kind of see how the teleconverter would perform in the best conditions possible. So obviously in the real world things would be rather different. I'd probably have to have the shutter speed much higher, which means I'd have to crank the ISO up, which of course means there'd be some noise coming in. I'd probably have to physically hold the camera and press the button because I'd probably be tracking some kind of a subject, and you know, I might well be on the tripod, but a lot of the time in my photography I go handheld, so I'd probably have to find something to lean against or put a beanbag or my rucksack down on the ground and get a really good stable position if I was going to even think about using teleconverters on certainly on the 500, and if I was thinking about using the 300 I'd probably want a tripod or a support anyway because it's a bit heavy. So even though the 500mm and the 2x teleconverter technically can produce the better image compared to cropping, the chances of actually getting that image in the real world are a lot lower than without the teleconverter. So you have to really make a call. In wildlife photography, the moment often happens so quickly that in a lot of situations I'm much more likely to just take a burst without the teleconverter, or maybe just with the 1.4 times, and be a little bit more certain of some of those being good than risking it and going with a 2x converter, even though the quality might not be as good if I then have to crop that image. Something I have not mentioned so far at all is video. And in video I'm much happier using the teleconverters, and the reason is I'm often on a tripod and I'm often using much lower shutter speeds anyway, so I'm using a 60th of a second, for example, and coupled with being on the tripod and the vibration reduction in these lenses, which is excellent, I can get really nice results even with the 2x teleconverter on both of these. And also in video, stopping down to f11 or even higher in good light is not actually unheard of. The other thing I've not mentioned so far is the Faff Factor. If you're out somewhere mucky or dusty, or it might be raining or snowing, the last thing you want to do is unmount your lens to put a teleconverter in and you know, put it all back together again and risk getting stuff inside. I mean, it's bad enough as it is that you have to, you know, clean the gunk off your sensor quite often if you're out and about doing wildlife photography, where you're going to be getting down on the ground and in places where it's just not clean. So yeah, that's a thing that you really have to kind of consider as well, which is that, is it worth the hassle of putting a teleconverter on? So while both lenses did pretty well at sort of the 10 to 15 meter range of that first set of test images, there was a noticeable drop in quality with the 300mm and the longer teleconverters at the further distance. Now that might well have been to do with air mass and heat shimmer and the fact that the subject was a bit too small really for that range. But the fact remains that the 300 suffered more in that situation than the 500 did. So something is going on there. I mean, I'm not prepared to kind of make a conclusion from this test, but coupled to the fact that other people have told me that they find it difficult to get a sharp image with the 300mm and the 2x converter at longer range, I think there is possibly something going on there. So I think the most interesting thing that I've got from making this video is the discovery, for me, that the 500mm PF lens on my Z7 produces really quite good images with the longer teleconverters, at least under these test conditions. And I'm certainly going to be trying that out more in my photography. Anyway, the very idea that you could shoot with a 1000mm lens f11 is absolutely bonkers to my kind of DSLR entrenched mind. I mean, I've only been shooting a mirrorless camera for a couple of years now, but this really does go to show that with mirrorless, teleconverters have a slightly different role to play, and maybe a bigger role to play in sort of day-to-day wildlife photography. And I think it's only going to get better, actually. I have heard very, very good things about the 1.4 times and 2 times teleconverters that are native to the Nikon Z mount. Now, I don't have those teleconverters, nor indeed do I have a lens that I could use them with, but one day maybe I will, and it'll be very interesting to try them out. So that pretty much wraps up this video. I guess it's probably been quite a long one, but I hope it's been interesting. I need to put in the usual disclaimer, which of course is that kit varies. So your mileage might vary. All I can tell you is what I saw under my test conditions with my kit, and I hope that I've been able to describe what I've seen and also describe how I did the tests well enough that you can draw your own conclusions from that as well. So I'll finish this video by tagging on a bunch of images at the end where I've used teleconverters on these 2 lenses in the last year or so. I hope you've got something from this video, or you found it interesting. It's certainly been a lot of me talking, so if you are using this video to try and lull a small child to sleep, I hope you've been successful. You know who you are. Anyway, if you have got something from it, please like it, share it with your photography community, and leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you found with your use of teleconverters on either of these lenses. And yeah, if you have enjoyed this video, or you enjoy the wildlife photography content that I put out on YouTube and you're not already a subscriber, please consider subscribing to the channel. I should also say thank you very, very much to all the people who have subscribed to the channel, because just very recently that's passed 3,000, which is a great milestone, and it was really, really nice to see that the channel kept growing even though I've not been able to release very much content at the moment. So I can actually tell you that the next video that I'm going to release on the channel is going to be all about the highs and lows of trying to catch up with a big flock of geese that are wintering in this area and trying to get some photos of them. And I can tell you that because I have in fact recorded all the footage for it, or some of the footage. I might still record more. It's very hard to know when to stop, but I should be getting that together, and hopefully I'll see you on that one fairly soon. So thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.